You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side live at a special time here, Tuesday, the 23rd of May. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, great to be back with you.
Great to be back on with you, Eugene. You missed it. I saluted you.
I did miss it. I appreciate you saluting me. You know, I'm a big saluter, whatever that is. You know, listen, I'm all about showing people their appropriate hierarchical respect. It's who I am as a person. I like to respect people for who they really are. I like to respect our viewers for who they really are, which are fantastic, great people. And we thank you for being here with us. Got a great show, as we always do, swinging around the continents. All the big stories you could imagine, from the G7, Ukraine, artificial intelligence, Ecuador, the environment, not going that well, spoiler alert, and also Colombia. So we've got a lot to cover here on the show. So this would be an excellent time for you to let anyone you know, somehow, some way, air horn or something, let them know that you are here, you are watching us. We are live on the Breakthrough News YouTube. And of course, since you are watching on YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe. Then you also want to make sure you hit the bell so you get the alerts about everything you have subscribed to. Lots of good stuff coming from us, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek. So make sure you subscribe, make sure you hit the bell. And what else, Rania?
Well, if you would like to access exclusive content, including the second half of my episodes of Dispatches, as well as Eugene's monthly seminar on Africa, which is about to get very exciting very soon. Already is exciting, but even more exciting. We're about to bump that up even higher in terms of excitement, as well as other exclusive content. You can become a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news, and you will be able to access all that exclusive content. So I highly encourage you to do that. It also helps support all of our excellent programming here, so we can keep stepping up for you and bringing you great coverage of all things around the world. Also, if you want to do a one-time donation, you can do that as well. You can donate below on YouTube. You can also donate in the live chat. And if you and we'll try to shout you out if we get a chance to. Usually we do. And then also you can go to breakthroughnews.org and you can do a one-time donation there as well. But most importantly, highly encourage you to become a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news, and you can access exclusive content, which if you are supporting the show, you absolutely deserve.
Yes, I agree 100%. And shout out to everyone who's already a patron and everyone who's already helping in a myriad of different ways. We really appreciate you. Well, we will go ahead and turn to our first story here. Excuse me, sorry about that. Which is Ecuador, where there is a new upcoming election in Ecuador in the wake of an attempted impeachment of the President Guillermo Lasso. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Pilar Fernandez, who is a researcher from the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Pilar, thank you so much for being with us here on the show. Oh, you might be muted.
Oh. What do we call them? Technological gremlins?
Little technical glitch here.
Oh, there we go. I think we can hear you now.
We can hear you now, although it's a little feedback.
Yeah, we got to fix that audio.
Yeah. Okay. Pilar, you can hear us.
I think she can hear us. The issue is on her end with the microphone. Let's maybe try to have that fixed.
No, we're still seeing if we can get you in. Yeah, there we are. We'll see if we can get Pilar back here. Very important issue in Ecuador,
I'm sure we will. I'm sure we will.
Country of Ecuador. Feel confident we will get her back. Range of things that are out there happening in the world. Rania, I know you said you wanted to talk more about sports, although I bet you are following what's happening with Mr. Vinicius and Real Madrid in Spain.
Actually, Eugene, I will have you know I've been following it I actually have not. I have no idea what sport you're
Oh, I
talking
was
about
like, you're
right
gonna.
now. But I had you.
Yes, you did. Well, listen, it's a big story. Vinicius, who's a famous player at Real Madrid, he's Brazilian. He's a black Brazilian. Essentially, he's refusing to play in Real Madrid anymore because the level of racism is so high there in La Liga. He's been the victim and was recently the victim of some racist taunting. Sadly, this is pretty much par for the course in UEFA, all across the European leagues. There's been a pushback from the league, from FIFA, from others. I would say to some degree it has been moderated, but obviously it's not there. But ultimately, the various Spanish football officials, La Liga, are now pushing back and basically being like, no, we're not racist. So it's becoming a big issue. President Lula is supporting him. It looks like the government of Brazil is saying they may take some action. FIFA is also supporting him. So it's an interesting point about this sort of ongoing issue in European soccer, which anyone who is watching European soccer, there are many, many black people from Latin America and Africa who play in all of the leagues. The things, people throwing banana peels on the field, doing monkey sounds, worse things than that, worse slurs than that being thrown out there. It's bad. It's pretty bad. I mean, I will say it's actually gotten better because they push back, but it's still out there. But I think that's why they're trying to defend it. So anyway, an interesting story for people to look up who are interested certainly in anything regarding, the struggle against racism. But if you're interested in soccer, potentially big moves because it could heavily affect the league and who's playing who's playing where, and whether or not, we'll start to see a shift away from some of these European leagues by players coming, from Latin America and from Africa who just don't want to put up with this nonsense.
I mean, I do remember watching the World Cup, which is one of the only times I watch what I like to call soccer.
Yeah.
And what the rest of the world likes to call football. But no, I do remember watching, and I mean, I'm sure anybody who was watching the World Cup recognized just how many players on most of the European teams were black. Of course, a lot of the Latin American teams have a lot of black players as well, though typically those black players are actually from the populations in those countries.
Yes.
But of course, whether we're talking about Spain or whether we're talking about France and I mean, yeah, a lot of those people are nationals too. But it's just, it definitely demonstrates a level of whether it's Germany, gosh, so much of the German team is black.
It's true. Yeah. Well, I think we have Pilar back. This is a good conversation. We'll come back to it. Of course, the intricacies of international football. We want to bring Pilar back here. Pilar, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
We got you here now, loud and clear. And I just will start here by asking, and I mentioned in the beginning, President Lasso is dissolving the legislature. Looks like things will go to elections. I mean, how did we even get to this point where we have a president trying to dissolve the legislature and go back to the electoral stage?
Well, there's a huge political crisis caused by a disastrous administration. And the point is important to make here is very complicated, so bear with me. Because under the Ecuadorian legislation, is it possible for the president to dissolve the assembly? It's something that is considered in our constitution, but he can only make it once, and during the first 3 years of mandate. The issue here is why he was doing that, because the reasons were terrible social upheaval. Constitutional reasons would be terrible social upheaval, or if the assembly took up on functions that are not constitutionally granted to the assembly, let's say, or if it's obstructing the national development plan. Those are the reasons. Nothing of the sorts is happening. What is happening is he was about to be impeached. No, he was under a process of impeachment, and on May 9, the assemblies or Congress approved a motion for the continuation of the impeachment trial against Lasso with 88 votes. To be impeached, it was required to have 93 votes. And it seems the opposition got enough votes, and he already said a month ago that he will dissolve the Congress. Why? Because for him it will be easier to rule without the Congress by decree. That's what's going to happen from now on during maximum 6 months. Our constitution says that the National Elections Council should call for elections as soon as possible they already announced that tomorrow they will be calling for elections, probably for August the 20th. But until the elections and then the results, and we have usually two, like a first round and then a ballotage, it will be 6 months all in all. During all that time, he will be governing by decree, or a constitutional court can and should observe some of those decrees if needed. But we are not sure of what will happen, because it seems likely he will try to do what he couldn't do with an assembly, a democratically elected body, through decrees.
Well, so
That's,
Pilar, can you tell us? Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off there.
no, it's like, as I said, that is what it's happening now and the immediate future. How how do we arrive to this point? Well, Lasso was applying neoliberal policies, the same as the previous President Moreno. So, because of an agreement with the IMF, he cut terribly the public spending. He eliminated subsidies and was trying to privatize key public companies. He haven't managed to privatize, but that was his objective. In doing so, he fired many civil servants, and the lack of resources in the government uh, resulted in lack of services for the people, lack of good quality healthcare, lack of funding for public education, lack of medicines. Like if you go to a public health facility right now, probably there's a doctor, but there are no supplies and no medicines. Poverty has grown, unemployment also a lot, and precarious jobs are the norm. So he has like 10% of popularity among the people, and he broke his alliances. He has a very small party, 12 members in the assembly, and with his close allies, he reached up to 25 out of 137. So he was in alliance with several other parties, but those alliances are now broke. We need to remember that this mechanism of dissolving the Congress can also be the other way around. I mean, the assembly can, like without an impeachment trial, can overthrow the president just once, but then it also, there are elections for everyone, president and the Congress. They tried to do that in June 2022 after those big protests that I'm sure you covered, but they couldn't get the votes. So it was 80 and they needed 93. This time they got already 88. No, it was the other way around. The assembly tried to overthrow the president. Now it's the president dissolving the assembly, but mechanism is the same. There must be elections more or less immediate.
Well, can you tell us, I mean, now that we've heard so much about Lasso and his actions and his tenure, what does the opposition landscape look like? Oh,
Oh, we may have lost you again, audio wise.
muted.
See here. Let's give us 1 second as we figure this out. Well,
Well,
still waiting here. Yeah. Well, we'll see where we are. I mean, I don't want to say too much because we may get Pilar back here. Although it's going to be a very interesting question. I mean, you just asked an interesting one about the opposition. Well, maybe I'll just wait for a second here before I say anything about that. I don't want to say anything about that would overshadow
you don't
our
want a
guest here.
spoiler. You don't want to give a spoiler, Eugene.
You don't want to give a spoiler, although I would say the thing that's notable about this is if there was an election and if more progressive parties were able to come in, it would be basically a clean sweep. I think it would be Paraguay would be one of the last, Paraguay, Peru, I think maybe Uruguay. I don't know. I think the Broad Front is still in Uruguay. Someone will have to fact check me there. But anyway, it would be another kind of big victory for the sort of progressive wave in Latin America. And of course, Ecuador was key to that in the sort of first so-called pink tide movement, and now sort of the resurgent pink tide movement. So it would be yet another one. And, nestled right there between two others, Colombia and Venezuela. I think we do have Pilar back here. Yes, Pilar, we do have you. And I think Rania was just asking about the opposition landscape and what the scene looks like there.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm sorry. I don't know what is happening with my computer right now.
No worries.
But, okay, it's pretty divided. You have opposition on the right from a traditional right-wing party called Social Cristiano. Then you have the opposition on the left that is basically formed by two factions, two groups, let's say. One is the group close to former President Correa, called the Citizens' Revolution Movement. Now it has another name because, but it's a long story. They had to change party, and so now it's Unión por la Esperanza, something like Union for Hope. And you have Pachacutic, which is the indigenous party, you may say. Those have a historical disagreement about many things, but the interesting thing right now is the main organization, social organization, people's organization in Ecuador is the indigenous movement. And it has CONAIE, that's National Confederation of Indigenous Peoples. It's the main organization. CONAIE created Pachacutic, the political party, like in the late 90s. But since then, they have drifted a bit apart. So it's not that Pachacutic represents exactly the indigenous movement or their vote. In fact, lately, Pachacutic has been not in the left, but way closer to a center-right party. And so right now, CONAIE has a more to the left leadership. So I don't know what could happen there, even though there was an announcement today that probably the candidate from that side will be Salvador Quispe, who is clearly on the right. We need to remember that Pachacutic, even now, part of it is was trying to impeach Lasso. Pachacutic before was in alliance with Lasso. The Citizens' Revolution, the Correísta movement, has always been against Lasso, and then we have other small forces, mainly Izquierda Democrática, like Democratic Left, another center right-wing party, who was also in alliance with Lasso and now broke with him. And there are many other small parties, mostly to the right wing, who will be trying to get like an outsider right now, because if there are elections, we hope so, it will be only for the 2 years until the new regular term for a president, let's say until 2025. That is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's going to be quite interesting, certainly, and perhaps another bite at the apple for the left in Ecuador. Pilar, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank to you, and sorry for the inconveniences again.
No problem at all. No problem at all. That's the name of the game in the 21st century. It's where we are. Listen, the internet is not always going to work the way you want it to work. That's just that's it. I mean, we're in a high-tech world, but not fully, I don't know what else to say about that. Either way, why don't we just turn the page and turn the agenda here to the G7, recently passed G7 summit that took place in Hiroshima, Japan. Of course, the traditional G7 countries, the United States, Europe, Japan, but there's also other countries were invited. India was there. Comoros was invited there. Comoros is the presidency of the AU this year. And of course, Mr. Zelensky was also there from Ukraine, which more or less overshadowed the rest of the entire meeting, in addition to the harsh statement against China that was made, but we're very happy to be joined here by Breakthrough News' own Brian Becker, host of the Socialist Program, here on Breakthrough News to discuss all of this. Brian, thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be here.
Well, I mean, I'll just start with the fact that it took place in Hiroshima, the G7 summit, which felt notable, given that, of course, Hiroshima is one of the places devastated by atomic weapons launched by the United States at the end of World War II. But here we are yet again under the nuclear shadow, if you will, and most of the meeting was aimed towards increasing the tensions in terms of nuclear saber rattling, from my point of view, Brian, but I wonder what you thought.
No, indeed. I mean, when you think about what happened with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bombs dropped just a few days apart in 1945, it wasn't mainly to defeat Japan. Japan was about to surrender no matter what. It was the opening shot of the Cold War, the war between the United States and world capitalism against what was then the Soviet Union. Here we are, many, many decades later, the same capitalist countries meeting in Hiroshima, again, preparing for war, literally preparing for war, not any longer with the Soviet Union per se, but with Russia, which was, of course, the anchoring republic in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Sometimes the imperialists who used these weapons of mass destruction killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Again, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not bombed earlier so that the U.S. could have a clean laboratory type experiment to see what the damage would be if an atomic bomb was dropped on human beings. And so these civilian cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who again had been exempted from earlier bombing campaigns, were destroyed in a moment. These same imperialists are sort of holding their hand to their heart and worrying about the human rights of other people, including the people of Ukraine. And at the same time, escalating the war against Ukraine, against Russia, the proxy war. And right before Zelensky made his dramatic theatrical appearance, and let's never forget that there have been many times in the entertainment industry where comedians move on to play a serious acting role, and that's what Zelensky has done. He's like Robin Williams or Eddie Murphy when they went from being comedians to being like a serious actor. This theatrical performance, he zooms in. But days before that, the Biden administration says, yeah, we're going to send F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. That means the U.S. is taking the next step towards real war with Russia. First, it was the M1 Abrams tanks. They said they weren't going to send them. Then they sent them. Now the F-16s. We're on the path towards confrontation. And Eugene and Rania, I think people should just remember that it wasn't even just the 2014 U.S.-sponsored coup that led to this crisis, but there was the 2008 decision by NATO to expand into Ukraine and Georgia. At that time, the Russians moved their military forces into Georgia. They said that's never going to happen. Then they said again after 2014, it's never going to happen. And then most notably, in 2018, the U.S. unilaterally canceled the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Missile Treaty, that would thus allow the United States to place intermediate missiles that had a flight time of 6 minutes to their targets at the Russian-Ukrainian border. That's what prompted the current crisis. And that's the commitment that the United States has made to its people, to Russia, to Europe, to the world. We're preparing for major power conflict. Here we are, decades after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, again with Russia.
It's so interesting because it's like the G7 and the whole framing at the G7 where it was, yes, like I remember there's one headline. It was like Zelensky's the star of the G7, but China's the one that everybody's talking about. And it's kind of sad to be Zelensky because it's like no matter where he goes, something is shining brighter than him, whether it's fear mongering about China at the G7 or him coming to the Arab summit for some reason, which made no sense at all. When like the star of the Arab summit was actually Syria because they just re-entered the Arab League. But that's all to say, obviously, like there's such a drastic difference here between what you see from like the BRICS countries, for example, who when they talk about Ukraine and Russia, and obviously Russia's a part of BRICS, but I mean the other countries as well, when they're talking about Ukraine and Russia, they're talking about how do we get to peace? How do we get to diplomacy? Whereas on the other side of the G7, it's just this, more war. We have to arm Ukraine more. We have to give more weapons to Ukraine. And also, by the way, China's coercive and aggressive, and we have to do something about that. I don't know. Can you just talk about the juxtaposition there? Because it really does show such a massive gap between these countries that represent a way bigger swath of humanity compared to these G7 countries that are just like, the imperialists.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, we said on the Socialist Program, my show that's also on Breakthrough News, that there was a new era of global politics had arrived with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that doesn't mean you have to support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but we should objectively acknowledge that this is a new era. And the era between 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the socialist camp, and 2022, when Russia invaded, that was a period where the U.S. basically strong-armed every country in the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America, tried to with Russia and China. And for a long time, Russia and China appeased the United States. Remember, they both abstained at the Security Council rather than vetoing the resolution that authorized the bombing of Libya. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, it was like, hey, there's a new day because Russia has decided to end, from its point of view, the idea of always acquiescing to American power. And now you see that Africa and the Middle East and Asia, including traditional U.S. allies, are actually taking advantage of this new era of global politics to also find a way to sort of exercise some degree of sovereignty from the empire, to say we're going to be independent. And actually, while they don't approve and support and endorse Russia's military action in Ukraine, you can see that by strengthening their ties to Russia, they're actually increasing and supporting the idea that there should be a multipolar world. A lot of people are talking about this. And you don't have to see the multipolar world as the panacea to the world's problems to recognize why countries in the global south, especially countries that are emerging countries with strong economies, they want to be able to speak for themselves. They want to be able to be independent countries. Like no country really wants to live under the thumb of some foreign power. And so this new era of global politics, the mantra of peace rather than war is in a way saying no to U.S. imperialism, because the only acceptable answer to the U.S. is more war, as you said, Rania, more war, support Ukraine to the hilt, and don't you dare talk about peace. So when Modi talks about peace, when Africa talks about peace, when China talks about peace, the United States actually considers this to be a subversive element in world politics. And that's the reality. That's where we are right now.
Brian, I think that, this is an important question. And I think in terms of where we are right now, people are wondering, is there a possibility for peace? I mean, in addition to, what peace actually means, could it happen? Obviously, the West does not want it. I mean, we've seen this, small Ukrainian incursion into Russia and the Belgorod region, although they, of course, say that it's some Russian dissidents they've armed. I don't know what is that, but either way, it's basically the same thing. Obviously, we are seeing, the ongoing fighting that just ended in Bakhmut, the possibility, or allegedly ended in Bakhmut, some say, but, the possibility of a Ukrainian counter assault here. And, it's interesting. I was looking earlier, there's this African peace plan that South Africa is touting, where 6 African leaders are allegedly going to go to Kiev and Moscow and try to bring together peace, including Zambia, Senegal, Congo, Uganda, maybe Egypt. But they basically are saying, or planning to say to Ukraine, that they cannot demand full withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukrainian territory as, at the outset to get talks going. Ukraine, of course, is never going to say that. So again, yet another peace plan that seems like it could be dead on arrival there. So, I mean, what do you think about the possibilities or what it would really take for there to be serious negotiations on this issue?
I think it's unlikely for the time being. And I think one of the reasons the U.S. is elevating and exaggerating the world stage role of Zelensky is to kind of say it's not up to us, it's up to the Ukrainians. Where the reality is, if the United States said to Ukraine, you have to come to peace with Russia right now, Zelensky would have to do it, because all the U.S. would have to say is we're going to start to hold back on weapon shipments, and that would be it, right? So Zelensky, this exaggerated role he's playing on the world stage is to camouflage the fact that the U.S. needs to find a way to shield or camouflage its role in perpetuating the war. So when the African countries or the Middle East countries or China or Brazil say, let's have peace, the U.S. and the European imperialists can say, it's not up to us, it's the Ukraine, it's that great leader, Zelensky, exercising his real bold, audacious determination to go forward. And as respecters of Ukrainian sovereignty, we have to follow him. The reality is quite different. The U.S. is calling the shots. The U.S. is leading. It has command and control over the Ukrainian armed forces. It's financing the war. It's providing all the weapons that Ukraine needs. So the reason I think peace won't break out is not because of Zelensky's obstinacy. I think that's, again, just sort of a theatrical performance that the U.S. is using. I think it's because the U.S. at this stage really is not unhappy at all with the conflict. I think the U.S. likes the conflict. It's a moneymaker for the military-industrial complex. It keeps Europe in tow. It joins Europe to the hip rather than gravitating towards Russia or China. And in fact, I think it's the best possible outcome for U.S. imperialism in the empire to retain control over the status quo. And if there was to be peace, what would happen? The European countries would say, at last there's peace. Now we can start to increase our trade with Russia and China. That's the thing the U.S. absolutely fears, is the integration of its traditional allies, imperialist allies, in with Russia and China. And then you have the power of emerging Africa and emerging India and emerging Brazil, and not to mention South Africa in the southern part of Africa. You know, this is a powerhouse combination for a new world order. And U.S. imperialism is doing everything, as did all the empires in the Middle Ages. You know, they did everything in their power. They left no stone unturned to retain the status quo. Eventually, they were swept into the dustbin of history, which I think is exactly what will happen to U.S. imperialism and its European allies. But they're going to do everything to prevent that. They're going to go kicking and screaming. That's what makes the current situation so gravely dangerous. And American people need to know Russia's not about to invade the United States. China's not a menace. That's not what's going on. But the U.S., U.S. imperialist ruling class, in order to retain its hold as a world power, is willing to risk global war and global catastrophe. That's why it ripped up all those arms deals, like the one I mentioned, the INF Treaty. We're playing with fire right now, and these privileged, rich brats like Antony Blinken and that other team of State Department people who never had to want anything, need anything, have always had a silver spoon in their mouth, have really from the bourgeoisie. They're playing games, but it's our people, our working class people all over the world who are going to ultimately pay the price. And that's why we have to expose the war for what it really, really is, which is not a defense of Ukraine. It's a defense of U.S. empire at the moment where U.S. empire feels and can sense and can see its own sort of lifespan diminishing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, go ahead, Rania.
I was going to say, well, I mean, no, it was well said. It is really incredibly dangerous. And I like that you called all those people rich brats. Yes. That was my favorite part of what you just said.
Well,
it's very
I hope,
true.
Yes,
well,
indeed.
They are,
well,
they are people who were born with a silver spoon in their mouth. Antony Blinken's dad was a leader of the Cold War, privileged country club folks who never suffered anything. Anyway, with that said, they're the ones driving U.S. policy.
Indeed. Well, I really hope people are watching the Socialist Program here on Breakthrough News, hosted by Brian Becker, digging into all of these topics very, very deeply. Brian, as always, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Great pleasure. Great pleasure. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's turn the page here from the G7 summit, as it were. There's a lot there, so don't even want to get sidetracked too much with even thinking too much about some of that because we'll be here all day. So let's move to our next topic here of artificial intelligence, another one that is stalking us all in a way that seems very, very scary. And to help us sort through all of that, we are very, very happy to be joined by Belinda Li, who's a PhD student at MIT working on natural language processing and machine learning. Belinda, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. And I'm just recovering from a cold, so apologies if I have a bit of a cough right now.
No worries, no worries. I appreciate you joining us. And I guess I wanted to start, not to sound like I'm some sort of congressman in the TikTok hearing, but we talk a lot about artificial intelligence. It's so much sort of out there in the world that I actually wanted to start just by asking you, like, what is AI? Like, what are we really talking about in a lot of these discussions? Because I think that can be an important framing.
Yeah, for sure. And I understand, like, I think the word AI is a very kind of large term. It's not exactly, encapsulating exactly what's going on underneath. So without getting into like much of the technical detail, a lot of these like systems like ChatGPT, like DALL-E, they're trained to essentially kind of imitate humans, right? So GPT is what we call in the field a large language model. And a language model is simply a system that models the probability of the next word given everything that was said previously. So you can think of it as like a giant statistical machine. If you feed it enough data, enough sentences, you'll eventually get a pretty good model or a pretty good imitation of what words typically come next in a given context. And it turns out if you scale this up to a massive amount of data, and if you use a huge model, so these are called large language models, you get this really fantastic distribution of text. You've seen everything on the internet, and you can do some pretty cool things, right? Obviously, you can't do everything, but you can get a pretty good model of what like humans would typically say in a given context. You can like get GPT to write an email for you or like to write some sort of story, but once again, this is all like trained off of data that was scraped from the internet. And this is kind of what is fueling the current unprecedented hype. So it's not actually, I would not call it actually like artificial intelligence, but what it's really doing is it's like really good at mimicking what humans have already put out there.
And of course, we keep seeing these sort of like doomsday predictions. One of them was by this so-called godfather of AI. I don't know if he's actually the godfather of AI or how he got that name. You could maybe tell us more about that. But like warning that it could end the world as we know it. And others, we keep seeing these sort of like I said, doomsday predictions about the worst that AI could do. It could destroy humanity. And then that's like the most of it. And then the other complaints are more like, I have a lot of college professor friends who are like really irritated with the fact that like it's really hard to deal with plagiarism now because it's like so easy to, have like some form of AI create your sources and like write some of your paragraphs. And it's hard to find because it hasn't been written before necessarily. So, I mean, that's a pretty broad spectrum of the problems with this sort of technology. But from your vantage point, like what's a realistic view of what the potential harm could be from all of this?
For sure, yeah. And thanks for bringing that up because, Geoffrey Hinton is a very important figure in AI, certainly, but I think he's also been kind of sidelined by a lot of the like Silicon Valley hype around AI currently. And I think a lot of what is being pushed right now by these like kind of AI influencers, a lot of these people are on social media, they're really pushing this hype of like, AI. They come from, there's a philosophy of long-termism that is kind of driving this sort of push, this sort of hype for like, there's going to be a super intelligent AI that kills us all, et cetera. And what they're really doing here is they're, first of all, like pushing this sort of narrative to try and hide kind of the real current harms of AI. And it's really great because you can kind of just make up whatever you want as to what the long-term harms of AI are and say that, like, we really deal with these issues rather than the current issues of like worker exploitation, of climate change, et cetera. And the other thing is this sort of hype also generates a lot of like revenue, a lot of profit for these companies as well, because what you're essentially doing is you can say that like, AI, you can cast AI is much more powerful than it actually is currently. And that generates a lot more hype and a lot more investment money into these models. But what I would identify as kind of like some key pitfalls of AI currently is, first of all, I agree that like the AI will have tremendous impact on the labor market going forward. And it is something that we see currently in the WGA strikes, for example. We see that companies, CEOs are rushing to really try and use AI to, continue to exploit workers or replace workers and try to make them redundant. Even if they're not quite there yet, they want to use this technology to like, continue to exploit workers. And furthermore, there's a great paper by Emma Struble that goes into kind of like the negative climate impacts of training these large models. Currently, to train these large models, you need a lot of compute, and that is very costly and also damages the environment. And other things include like if we want to deploy these models, for example, to write news articles or to like Bing is deploying them for search. These models oftentimes they don't stick to the facts. Like they can hallucinate. They're trained to mimic human data, but they're not trained to actually like vet the factuality of what they're spitting out. They're kind of like parrots in that sort of way. And because of that, like we see that like they oftentimes give you misleading information, unfactual information, and this can have like tremendous negative impact if people are actually trusting what these language models are saying.
One of the things that what you just said raises, I think, maybe one of the bigger questions here that I don't often see in the mainstream is, of course, there's the technology in and of itself, but of course, all technology is deployed by humans in some way, shape, or form. So is the issue as much the technology, or let me put it like this, is the issue as much sort of our regulatory frameworks and why people are deploying AI in certain reasons as much as the technology itself? Because I think sometimes it's sort of technology is just presented neutrally, like this thing is bad and will be bad no matter what. And I wonder if it's really that or just the way that the framework in which it's deployed currently in our society.
Yeah, I really think that it is the way that like it is deployed in our society currently. I think this technology has, very radical or a very good possibility of being used in ways that are like useful for humanity and useful for workers. But because of like, the capitalist society that we live in, this technology is currently under the control of like CEOs and under the control of, the investments, people who invest in these things. And what they're doing is they're using this technology to actually line their pockets rather than, actually help workers. And I think there are ways that like, this technology can be used as tools to make, our work more efficient, to like automate menial tasks or like really like dangerous tasks. But what we're seeing them being used for instead is actually to, replace workers and to make people redundant, and to, instead of like shortening our work days, they're used to like make one person take on the task of 10 other people, and then you're firing these 10 other people. So I think it really is like a question of just society as it is today, rather than like this technology is inherently going to be used for evil.
I wanted you to elaborate on that for a moment, because I think sometimes, like now that we're actually getting to the root of it here, which is the problem is actually we have a capitalist system that will use any form of technology to try to further exploit workers, pay them less, or have fewer to pay. And then, and that's the fear here. But in a different world, like you mentioned some of the possibilities of like, oh, you wouldn't have to do menial tasks. You could shorten the workday. Like what could, let's say in a socialist world, right? What could AI be used for in a positive, beneficial way under a system that, unlike capitalism, actually tried to benefit human beings rather than try to exploit them for, the profit of a few?
Yeah. That's a very good question. And I don't have a full vision of that yet because we're not there yet. But I would hope that like this technology, I hopefully one day, but I think this technology can be used again to like, make our labor both more, more interesting. We can automate the work that like, the menial tasks, like let's say sorting through a bunch of data or sorting through a bunch of emails, the stuff you do every day that like takes up time and is not very fulfilling, and give us more time to actually do the fulfilling tasks that we want to do as human beings, right? And I think like we can also see like I think what is really essential here is like not just regulating these companies, but having like these models actually be in the like have people have ownership of these models. Like the ownership of these models should be in the hands of the people, because effectively what companies always have an incentive to drive towards profit, and so regulation is always going to be like reactive rather than like proactive, and what hopefully we could envision is like actually people coming together and being able to decide like what sorts of technologies do we want to build that helps humanity, and how do we want to build it? How much like do the benefits outweigh the harms and risks here on the climate? Like is there any risk to deploying these technologies in the education sector where they can be used to like for plagiarism, etc. And actually have that be like a collective decision made by the people rather than like a select few powerful corporate entities.
No, well, that certainly sounds better than where we are right now. I will say that for sure. I mean, let me just ask you this, Belinda. I mean, what is as much as there are sort of negative externalities going on here, I mean, are there things happening around AI existing right now that you are excited about that maybe people should, know more about as opposed to only looking at one side of it?
Yeah, for sure. Some things that I think are very exciting. Well, I think generally, like, the technology itself is definitely very exciting and very transformative. But, currently it's being driven by, these corporations for profit. It's being kind of closed off to people. What researchers are trying to do right now is, so OpenAI is like, at least when they entered this field, they started closing off a lot of these models and closing off source codes. They started privatizing and like driving towards profit, right? And what a lot of researchers are trying to do now is trying to create open source replicas, so that we can actually, have a competitor, first of all, to like these giant ChatGPT like models, be able to like make sure that the like, that it's not like just monopolized solely by OpenAI. So I think those efforts are very exciting, and it would help democratize, the control of these models to at least, a bigger, at least the broader public rather than just within these companies. Other things I think are exciting are like applications to robotics, especially because like there's a lot of physical labor out there that's like dangerous or requires a lot of precision or is very, requires a lot of backbreaking physical labor, and that kind of stuff I think could benefit from automation. And yes, I also think that like there's applications as well to organizing, and like I'm a labor organizer, and I know that like I scrape through a ton of data every day to try and like figure out who to talk to and where would be good to like start organizing, and I think that kind of stuff can also be automated.
Mm-hmm. Belinda Li, PhD student at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, working on natural language processing and machine learning. Thank you for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side. Thank
you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad we have people with good politics at MIT.
There's actually a lot of them, by the way,
right.
And that's why MIT organized the largest Union Drive of the Year in 2022, if I'm not mistaken. If it wasn't the largest, it was the second largest. I believe it was the largest. Well over 3,000 students pushed back against one of the largest institutions in the country that did everything possible to try to trip them up and stop them. But nonetheless, they won. They won a union. They're continuing to push forward. I believe they're working on fighting for a contract right now. But, certainly hats off to them and many of the other graduate student workers who have organized recently here in the past weeks or had recent victories, from Rutgers to UC, and I think Stanford has an election coming up soon. So anyway, an interesting sector, but gives us the opportunity to at least have a collective voice that's pushing back against the constant corporatization of many of these issues.
Indeed.
But let's switch gears to our next issue. We just got a lot of existential issues hanging over us right now. Now we're going to go to climate change, maybe the most existential issue hanging over us all. And we are very happy to be joined for this conversation by Salvatore Ingo de Moro, who is a professor and chair of the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at SUNY New Paltz. Salvatore, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, no.
Oh, you might be muted.
Audio problem. We're going to fix this.
We certainly are.
Because we have important things to discuss. There we go. Oh, no. Nope. Now I'm just making noises of reaction.
No, sorry, can't hear you just yet here. We'll try to get this figured out as we move forward here. But yeah, well, it'll certainly be interesting to see, from a perspective of, I think, jobs more than anything else. I think in the immediate piece, the immediate sort of future here, what the impact is of AI. That's certainly one of the things that I think is sort of flying under the radar. You see it a lot actually with, the switch over to electric vehicles, because now the manufacturing has become so much more, technologically advanced that, and also the vehicles themselves, I think, use less parts and things like that, that you need significantly fewer people. So, I mean, thoughts that there could be, maybe even north of 100,000 auto worker jobs lost in this shift to EVs, which is the thing they don't tell you about. Now, there's another way to go, and I've also seen some reports that say you could add jobs this way, so it's not a preordained conclusion. But when they're telling you about how we're moving to EVs, quote unquote, they certainly never tell you about that part of it. And I think there's a lot of different sort of situations where that is in fact the case. I mean, obviously truck drivers is one a lot of people talk about. I was just in San Francisco too, by the way, Rania, and you'll be excited to know, I'm sure, that there are self-driving cars like on the street, because, they're training them, the companies, they're trying to get them together. So it's pretty wild to see these just totally driverless cars driving by you. I mean, I was not ready for that.
Crazy and sort of creepy, but I guess they have lower rate of accident than human error.
I mean, right now when they've barely done anything and are barely on there, but it's. I actually was asking someone who worked in AI about this when I was out there, and it's exactly what Belinda says. It mimics human behavior, but it's not the same. So it's it drives all around the city of San Francisco, so it knows everything about San Francisco. But what if a traffic light gets replaced with a crossing guard because there's some special thing going on? Will the car know how to react? And those are all kind of unknowns. And since driving, as you know, contains quite a bit of unknowns, change circumstances, so on and so forth. It's that to me is kind of the scary element of it, is that it'll appear as if it's safer, but then as soon as you roll it out, it won't really be safer, which is why a lot of people are saying there's not going to be much of a future for self-driving cars beyond very, very simple tasks, but driving will become more automated, but the role of the human will still be pretty significant. I think we do have Salvatore back with us here.
Oh, I hope so. Can you hear me?
Sure do.
Time?
We can hear you.
Brilliant.
We got you close here. Well, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Obviously there's so many things we could say about climate change. One of the things I think is most significant to talk about is it appears that we are not on track to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, which is obviously pretty bad. I mean, that was the sort of almost worst case scenario type of goal. So could you just explain where we are in that trajectory and what it would mean for humanity to, breach that threshold?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on, and it's an honor to be in your company. I'd like to emphasize that what might not be mentioned in the report is that climate change has been happening for decades. And already hundreds of thousands, if not several million people, have had their lives ruined or have had have lost their lives, mainly regions within Africa or the Pacific Ocean, because of underdevelopment, directly tied to basically neocolonial policies, especially from former colonial powers and US governments, and also because of local rulers' misleadership in alliance with foreign investors and the like. But in many regions, warming has already surpassed 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. More than a fifth of all people live in regions that have already seen warming greater than 1.5 degrees Celsius in at least one season. Hazards related to climate change tend to be higher at lower latitudes in the tropics, and especially for the disadvantaged or marginalized communities. But to turn to the question about why 1.5 degrees Celsius is so important, if at all, is because it's limiting that average warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would reduce, according to projections, the number of people frequently exposed to extreme heat waves. And today in Delhi, there's been a horrific scene at 45 degrees Celsius and just an emergency situation. But it would reduce the number of people frequently exposed to extreme heat waves by about 420 million, with about 65 million fewer people exposed to exceptional heat waves, like the one I just described about Delhi in India. And disadvantaged and vulnerable populations, some indigenous peoples and communities with livelihoods based on agriculture or coastal resources will be at the highest risk. Regions at the highest risk include Arctic ecosystems, and of course a lot of indigenous peoples live within those regions, dryland regions, small island countries, the least powerful countries, basically. So limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius could reduce the number of people susceptible to climate-related hazards by as much as several hundred million by 2050. And that's some number that we might want to kind of recall later on. But in any case, most land regions will see more hot days, especially in the tropics, and at 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, about 14% of the Earth's population would be exposed to severe heat waves at least once every 5 years. While if we were to get to 2 degrees warming, that number jumps to 37%. And extreme heat waves will become widespread at 1.5 degrees Celsius warming as well. And above that, twice as many megacities as today are likely to become heat stressed, potentially exposing 350 million more people by 2050. So for those who are interested, I'm just making heavy use here of a report from NASA relying on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But I really would like to stress that it needs to be understood that climate change refers to an average of the entire planet. So that means that some parts are getting very warm, and other parts of the planet may even be cooling. There are very few of those places, but it's an average. So there's no single 1.5 degree warmer world. The impacts of climate change are not spread evenly around the planet, and they will not be in future. And temperatures increase at different speeds in different places, with warming generally higher over land areas than oceans. And the strongest warming has been happening anyway already in the Arctic during its seasons. And then mid-latitudes, such as where we are, during the warm season.
To reinforce what you're saying here, there was this study published in Nature Sustainability that found that 2 billion people are at risk of extreme heat, as you were describing it, by the end of this century due to this warming. And it actually specifies that this is basically a third of humanity we're talking about, but almost entirely located in the global south, mostly in India, Nigeria, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Pakistan. Can you explain why this matters? And more importantly, the inequality of it all, because obviously the entire world is affected by the ramifications of this kind of global warming, but there's a particular portion of the world that's most impacted.
Yes, absolutely. It's a sordid situation. And it's really, one could even think about it as a global scale environmental racism issue. Those are countries with some of the highest, if not the highest, number of people in the world. And they have also extreme inequalities, which means that the possibility of a lot more people dying from the impacts of climate change than would be the case in the wealthiest countries is the case. And this is due to lack of access to healthcare, lack of home cooling technologies, insufficient urban green space, among other things, to help reduce temperatures, especially in poorer neighborhoods, and many other forms of inequalities that already lead to lower lifespans. So tearing through the 1.5 degree boundary will just exacerbate all those problems that already exist, unless among other international and national policies, there is something like, I could just name a few things, I suppose, like free technology transfers between countries, the abolition of patenting for life-saving and ecologically sustainable technologies, mass wealth redistribution within those countries that you just named, and sensible urban planning that includes all urban dwellers within those affected countries. So that likely means that there have to be blunt, governments that are of the socialist variety take it over to accomplish all those things, because it's obvious, or it should be obvious, I think, that businesses and capitalism-friendly governments have demonstrated over and over again to be inept, even at delivering on the basics for the majority of people in their respective countries. Those are some of the issues that I'd like to raise on this.
No, I think that's a critically, important issue, and I know that you were also a guest editor along with my good friend David Schwartzman of a recent issue of Science and Society on exactly this issue of the eco-socialist response. And just expand on that a little bit more, because I think this is an important aspect of how people are conceiving of a new world, because there's so much doom and gloom, and it seems like such a daunting problem that, to borrow another phrase, it feels like it can only really be thought of in a productive way, by looking at system change, as opposed to just, small, buy 10 more EVs or whatever.
Yes, quite. I wouldn't want to discount all the initiatives from below that have been happening for many decades, if not at least more than half a century. And those are also important. It's just that they're often very disconnected and they are, let's say, politically naive. But because, the 1.5 degree temperature rise has already been surpassed in several regions of the world, and this is something that's not taken up really as it should be in that report. It's now an even more urgent matter to mitigate, and to do mitigation by combining reductions in greenhouse gas emissions with tried and tested techniques in industrial production, farming, and all other economic sectors that help absorb greenhouse gases, aside from reducing their release into the air. So one of the issues as well, and this is something that with David Schwartzman, we've been trying to address, is that nuclear power is not really very helpful. Time is too short, and the many other kinds of environmental problems that nuclear power is associated with is just too much of a risk, and it's already well known that that it causes other sorts of problems, particularly in dry lands. If you can imagine, like the amounts of water that is necessary to run those nuclear plants, that's not sensible. In any case, there's so much rubbish, diversions like so-called clean coal and nature-based solutions. So all the existing techniques and technologies that are proven to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or to absorb greenhouse gases in ecologically sustainable ways need to be prioritized. And like, for example, combining solar energy with what most low-input farming communities already know how to do, and in combination with agroecological science. So there are solutions out there. There are also being put into practice. The Movimiento de Trabajadores Sem Terra, the MST, and Cuba have been showing the way forward in this for quite a while, for example, and also the People's Republic of China in terms of investing in solar and other alternative energy systems. Although, you might critique some aspects of those policies, but still, they're showing also the way forward in many ways. And all these kinds of change has to happen along, it's not a technical problem that one can resolve. It's a political problem, just like you were saying. It's about systemic change, and something that would already help would be cancelling national debts, for example, getting tax evaders, who include some of the most powerful corporations and government people around the world, cutting military budgets, especially the U.S. military budget, top greenhouse gas emitter itself. And much else needs to be done that helps gather the massive amounts of funds and wealth that everyone in the world generates every year. You can put those funds into socially useful ends, like building the capacities of the most affected, of the marginalized communities, so that they can have the infrastructure they need to have more urban green space, have access to the highest quality healthcare, to be able to grow drought-resistant crops, for example, and much else, so that they can engage in this capacity building to mitigate the effects of already existing climate change impacts. So it's still possible to mitigate, and even to do it to some extent with not exactly revolutionary policies, and at least by the year 2100, when it comes to the more disastrous conditions for the countries like India and Pakistan, Nigeria that you had alluded to earlier. But none of this can happen without well-coordinated mass mobilizations worldwide, especially the wealthiest and also the most populated countries like India. And in India, in any case, interestingly enough, it has been shown that it can be done, this mass mobilization, like the largest strike in human history, if I recall correctly, in 2020. That also is something that can show us the way. And if the ruling class of the world engage in repression for all that, then there's little alternative but kicking them out of power. But of course, that is something that hopefully can be avoided. And that's something that people should also be prepared for, especially these days when NATO powers seem in trend of starting a nuclear war, with all that they're pushing for. So there's a lot that, especially in the NATO countries, that needs to be done with urgency to get rid of these governments and have some sensible policy that can create the conditions to actually bring about mitigation measures worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I just wanted to raise one last thing before we wrap here, and that is, on the domestic front in the U.S., it was reported recently that there's this deal between Arizona, California, and Nevada that was agreed to basically take less water from the Colorado River, which has apparently been depleted and suffering from potential collapse by a mega drought, and then of course decades of overuse. And I think this points to a couple of things that you were mentioning, because this is something that was overseen by the Biden administration. So it shows that on some level, you can have a sort of you can have government intervention to do something decent and doable, which I think is what makes this deal important. But so in that sense, what does this mean about the power of the state, right? It shows that the Biden administration and many other governments around the world could be doing much more to help mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. It's just a matter of what they choose to do.
Oh, it's so true. And these are such excellent points that, along the other ones that you've already raised, both of you. This deal, I'm not exactly well versed in history of US policies and things of that nature, but I must say that it seems to me that it's an important deal because it shows that reducing water use is possible, but only by means of state intervention in some respects. So that already belies, a lot of the nonsense with respect to privatization, this and that. So in itself, that could be a major, official acknowledgement that businesses and business-friendly policies lead to disastrous mismanagement of water supplies. And that has anyway been the case for at least 100 years in the Colorado River region for whatever I recollect from reading about that history, which was quite a while ago, reading about that. But there are a lot of farming businesses. That's where a lot of the water goes. I think actually is to the large, very, very large farming business sector. Of course, the extremely large farms, mining operations, ranching, real estate interests already are also behind that. So, it's in their interest to conserve water supplies. So that raises other issues, but it's been at least 100 years of those interests blocking a sensible way of using water and blocking any long-term effective water conservation measures until massive droughts make it more obvious, unworkable, and unreasonable their demands for profits are when it comes to water supplies. But as I was trying to allude to just a little bit ago, there's more to this that needs to be worried about, I think, and I sense from reading that report, which I had to glance through. But I think that what they're missing, and what seems to be missing in the discussion so far, maybe I'm probably missing something anyway, but it's that there's a rather terrible history that is being kind of buried by what is being announced, or the way in which it's being announced. It's the fact that the Colorado River is controlled by a settler colonial state. And they effectively have taken away most indigenous communities' access to water. And many of those indigenous communities, like the Ute or the Navajo, and any others, maybe at least 30, have at least recognized by the state of by the U.S. federal system. To this day, a lot of them even lack piped water in their homes. This is already a disaster, even before this announcement, or even before this attempt, because it's not certain whether it's going to be put into practice, an attempt, to conserve water supplies. But this kind of environmental racism really got intensified, especially with the 1922 Colorado River Compact, which was about dividing water access among the states of Arizona, California, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, and Wyoming. And that really meant and still means to the benefit of especially the large, mainly white business owners of the day and today, and at the expense of most indigenous communities and millions of Mexicans downstream across the border. So this is one of the huge issues that seems to be being ignored at the moment. I haven't seen any discussion about these aspects, the longer term lack of access of many communities. And another one is about, well, how the water will be distributed and according to what criteria. It's something that I would think will have to be taken up. I mean, for example, how will landless farm workers in the region see any benefit to this agreement of drawing less water? What impact will that new policy have on people living across the border in the states of Baja California and Sonora in Mexico? So there are class, settler colonialism, environmental racism issues that should be brought out in the open about this new policy, and I hope it will be.
Mm-hmm. Salvatore Ingo de Moro, chair of the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at SUNY New Paltz. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the apocalypse is near.
Indeed. Well, want to push forward here. Thanks to our next guest for joining us. What's that?
I was just going to say, why did you agree with me? I literally just said the apocalypse is near, and you were like, indeed.
It seems to basically be.
I mean, what do you want me to say? The opposite.
That seems to be the upshot of it. I mean, it's already hundreds of thousands, millions of people's lives have been ruined because of this. Right. Whole parts of the world have already been turned into sacrifice sites. 115 degrees in New Delhi.
I'd say it's pretty bad. People power. We can prevent it. Just got to get in the streets. All right. Wow. We got to work on this. We got next topic. We're going to work on this.
Colombia, a place of hope, if that's what you're looking for. Very happy to be joined here by our good friend Zoe Alexandra, who's the co-editor of People's Dispatch, among many other things, covering social movements and left politics, quite frankly, all around the world, but certainly in Latin America and the Caribbean. Zoe, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
No, the pleasure is all ours. Colombia, of course, went through a pretty significant change with Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez becoming president and vice president, respectively there. Of course, ending the reign of the narco dictatorship that had been there for quite some time. So we wanted to check in and see more or less how things were going. I know there have been a number of progressive initiatives that have been forwarded and taken place already, including around healthcare and other things. And I mean, maybe if you could just to open up, but I mean, have we seen the sort of at least even some turning of the page in terms of the nature of the politics of Colombia that I think people were looking for after this election?
We definitely have seen that. I mean, in all areas of politics, of economics, of social life, I mean, the government of Gustavo Petro has been a complete shift. I mean, for example, in the international realm, which we've talked about a lot on this show, and especially we've covered at People's Dispatch, rekindling the ties between Venezuela and Colombia, Colombia becoming a bigger actor in the regional stage, advocating for Cuba. I mean, these sound like small details, but they're actually huge shifts for the region and have definitely had an enormous impact on how policy happens within the region, what the U.S. is actually able to get away with in the region, the fact that it doesn't have Colombia as its major ally in its international plots is a huge, important thing to recognize. And then, of course, in the social and economic area, which is really the most pressing, which is why so many people actually voted for this government of change, voted for Colombia Humana, voted for Gustavo Petro, Francia Marquez, people who are intimately tied to the movements in the country. Francia Marquez hailing from the Black communities process, from Cauca, who is very deeply involved in a struggle against illegal mining in her territory. Gustavo Petro, who was the mayor of Bogota and enacted many, many social policies. He also was active in the left-wing armed group in the 80s and 90s. And so these are people who know very well all of the social and economic problems facing the country. They are no strangers to how capitalism has really ravaged Colombia, how imperialism has ravaged Colombia, the fact that students are not able to study. And so this has been one of their primary areas. And so basically the main focus of Pedro's government has been pushing forward the agrarian reform, healthcare reform, labor reform, and pension reform. And so these are notoriously sticky areas, and especially in Colombia. The healthcare, for example, the reform that they're trying to enact there is of vital importance, because in Colombia, it's one of those countries that the saying about the healthcare system is that you die at the doors of the hospital before you get treated. That is how inefficient the system is. It runs through a series of kind of third-party providers, the EPSs, and it essentially channelizes a lot of money towards private insurance companies and leaves a lot of people without care. This is something we're very familiar with in the United States. And so that's why this was one of the key areas that Gustavo Petro wanted to reform. Why is all of this money going to the private sector and people are getting without healthcare? So they've been pushing through the healthcare reform, labor reform, similarly trying to guarantee some really basic rights for workers, supporting, for example, the initiatives of different trade unions in the country, pension reform, trying to make that more humane for retired people in the country. Again, a lot of these areas are dominated by the private sector, where the private sector has a lot of benefits. And so there's been subtle shifts to try to bring that back into the public sphere. And so he's faced enormous pushback, pushback from members of Congress and from other right-wing sectors who have been mobilizing. And he has actually called on his supporters to really take to the streets in a couple of different instances to support these reforms, which, again, he was really elected on this platform of healthcare, education, workers' rights, and pension reform, which is, of course, a really hot button issue today in the world.
And then, Zoe, another change in Colombia has been the resumption of these peace talks with the ELN. And this, of course, was initially what got Cuba placed on the state sponsor of terrorism list, or the U.S. used it for that years ago under Donald Trump because they were hosting these talks. But they started hosting them again. There was, I think, talks earlier this month that took place. Why is the resumption of these negotiations so significant?
Well, this is another area where the right wing has really been pushing back. So another key area, the key platform of Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez is this plan for total peace. And so for people who don't follow Colombian politics, it has been plagued with 6 decades armed conflict between left-wing guerrilla groups and, of course, the central government, fighting over basic things. I mean, these same things that the left-wing government now wants to actually enact, which is having access to land, having many different of the natural resources that Colombia has under public control. These have been some of the key motivating factors for the internal armed conflict in Colombia. And in the 21st century, there were impressive advances in peace under Juan Manuel Santos, who was the successor of Álvaro Uribe Vélez. There were peace talks started and completed with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, which took place in Havana. And peace talks were also started with the National Liberation Army, the ELN. This was started at the end of Santos's term, and the hope was that these peace talks would continue once Ivan Duque took office. But they suffered a series of misfalls. They were originally hosted in Ecuador, and when Lenin Moreno took office and essentially turned on the citizens' revolution, one of the first things he did was to say that Ecuador would no longer host these peace talks. And so Cuba, because it in this peace talks with the ELN was a guarantor country, which means that they are one of the countries that's supporting this process, said that they would again host another peace process. However, then when Ivan Duque was sworn in, this process was abruptly put to an end, halted. They never sent a government delegation to Havana, and instead they issued a Interpol warning. And this is essentially in complete violation of peace agreement protocol. I mean, there's peace agreements across the world. And, the number one thing you can't do is actually demand the arrest of a team that's been part of a process that has been sanctioned by Norway, sanctioned by so many other countries, that has actually rules and that protocol that you have to follow. And so Ivan Duque, being the extreme right-wing pundit that he is, he demanded that they be extradited. And this, of course, set off this whole saga, which we now know of Cuba being accused of being a state sponsor of terrorism. Gustavo Petro, in addition to returning to peace talks with the ELN, which again is so important given the history of 6 decades of armed conflict that Colombia has had to face, returning to peace talks, not only bringing peace back to the country, putting it back on the table as a central priority. He also called for Cuba to be taken off the state sponsors of terrorism list, recognizing the role that Cuba has played in all of these different peace processes. But also he's engaged in peace processes and tried to engage with other armed groups in the country. There's a number of paramilitary groups, of narco trafficking groups, of drug trafficking groups, that have control over a lot of large areas of land in Colombia that today are responsible for carrying out a lot of the assassinations of social leaders, of community leaders. He's also tried to engage with them because while the right wing has said the only way to deal with crime and to deal with these guerrilla groups is annihilation, is just killing them or ignoring that they exist, Gustavo Petro's government has said, we actually have to come to the table with these people. We have to figure out actually how to make this country a better place. And so the peace talks with the ELN are underway. There was also a cycle that was held in Mexico earlier this year. They're advancing and they're trying to reach currently the bilateral ceasefire. This could be a huge step for the country. It is currently the largest armed group active in the country. And so the possibility of total peace is something that cannot be undermined.
No, I think it's a good point. It actually sort of segues something you just said into the question I wanted to ask you, which is sort of maybe combining the issue of the pushback to Petro and the political scene and what we've seen from groups like, say, the Gulf Clan, who are obviously using, armed force to express their dissatisfaction with elements of the Petro government. And of course, for years, this sort of connection between, sort of the right wing of politics and the paramilitary movement was sort of a parallel way of preventing progressive change in the country. So, I wonder if there's still fears here that, in a way, it'll be difficult to engage some of those armed groups in peace conflicts because to some degree they're engaging in the armed action as part of a political strategy.
Petro is definitely in a very, very difficult situation. We reported People's Dispatch about the mobilization of hundreds of retired members of the military. Of course, active members of the military are prohibited from participating in any sort of political mobilization. And they were on the streets in big numbers, mobilizing specifically against Petro's plan for peace and his reforms to the healthcare system, et cetera. And they were actually, there was comments made by one of the retired members of the armed forces the next day that said that they were, this was following in the steps of Peru, and that, someday maybe soon they would be able to defenestrate the corrupt guerrilla president that they had, Gustavo Petro. And so he's really facing a very difficult situation. This coup attempt is just one sign of the fact that, of course, just because you get elected president does not mean that these forces of evil in some ways, these forces that really want to bring Colombia back to the dark ages, that don't believe in its progress, its development, in the fact that it should take care of the environment, engage in peace. All of these forces are not sitting back quietly. And one of the leaders of the opposition, Maria Fernanda Cabal, has been extremely active. She's sort of the successor to Uribe in some ways. She even traveled to Spain, met with the Vox Party during their election campaign, and saying how grateful she is that the Vox Party, the fascist right-wing party in Spain, is actually paying attention to Latin America and saving it, helping in its struggle against communism and against these corrupt people. And so there's many, many different forces that the government is having to grapple with. And of course, these paramilitary groups continue to be a key threat. During Petro and Francia's presidential campaign, they both received serious threats from these groups. At the end of the campaign, they would be on stage with bulletproof shields protecting them while they're at these, multi-thousand member events and rallies. They have had to deal with a lot of these difficulties. And this definitely isn't going away. But of course, the current approach of the government that was taken, which was to ignore it, and also to collaborate with the government of Iván Duque. There's many different links that have been proven that he had support and was working with some of these illegal armed groups. This, of course, was not the way to deal with these groups, and they only, got stronger under his government. And so he's trying out this approach, but I think it's going to be a long road. 60 years of armed conflict, internal armed conflict, does not go away with a 4-year presidency. And he's making incredible strides, but this is going to be a long process. And really re-educating all of Colombian society in a way of reorienting the culture, a culture that's been really based around this informal, to say it like that, sector of the economy, of drug trafficking, of all these different economies and societies that have really developed around that. And so it's a tremendous, tremendous task that he's facing. But I think that really insisting on peace and humanity and putting the needs of the most vulnerable Colombians is definitely the way to go.
Speaking of which, in Colombia, the term limit is 4 years and you don't get to have another term. So it's also like running against the clock as well. I mean, there's so much to change, right, in such a short amount of time. So I'm just curious, is this a conversation that like progressive forces in Colombia are having in terms of like, how do we sustain this, I guess, movement beyond just these 4 years?
Well, there is 2 terms, but
I'm sorry. I thought Colombia only had one. I take it back, and I'm so sorry if I scared anyone.
Well, you know what? We stay sharp, but I think that a key element and something that across the region people are grappling with is what to do when you have a progressive government that is operating in the confines of a bourgeois democracy that has all of the limits of not really being able to shape the base of the economy. Of, Petro himself has said, I am not against capitalism. He's not going to fundamentally change the capitalist system. This means that there's always going to exist these kind of contradictions within his government. And a major question across the region, as I said, in Brazil, in all of these countries where you have progressive governments, is how do movements maintain their autonomy? How do they respond? And how do they continue to grow in this moment where there's more openings, when there's more possibilities of people being more favorable to leftist and progressive ideas, but maybe where people feel like they're kind of set, they're demobilized, there's not something to drive them out onto the streets. And so I think this is something that the left and that movements in Colombia are grappling with. For decades, for 6 decades, they've been on defense. They've been, fighting for their lives, literally fighting extinction. And so now it's a moment of trying to rebuild and supporting, for example, I think the example of calling for mobilizations to support the reforms that are put forth by the government is such an important tactic that Petro is using to make sure that the streets are also supporting his government. He doesn't land in a situation where he is completely divorced from the movements, like maybe what happened in Chile with Boric and the left movements there, or with Pedro Castillo when it came time for his impeachment for the coup against him. He was essentially alone. He didn't have the support of the streets. He didn't have the force of the people to really reject these political maneuvers by the right wing. So I think there's constantly being lessons learned. I think what's happening in Mexico with Andrés Manuel López Obrador is also a very, very interesting case of really using the power and the support he has of the people. I mean, AMLO has a 70% approval rating. He has the people. He might not have the control and support of the oligarchs, but he can use the mass mobilization of people to gain momentum behind progressive politics.
Mm-hmm. Well, as always, Zoe, very comprehensive reporting on Colombia, like everywhere else. Really appreciate you giving us some of your time. And I hope everybody is regularly reading People's Dispatch, which is always being updated at all times of the day and night. So a great source for news on social movements around the world. But thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm. Well, ongoing things. Also, Francia Marquez, vice president, just ended her multi-nation tour of Africa, which is a big moment, of course, representing the Afro-Colombian population there. Very strong connections, making stronger connections to the African diaspora, sort of important culturally and intellectually. But thanks again to Zoe. Well, as always, Rania, this brings us to the tail end of the show, if you will. That's it for our guests. But of course, there are things we should remind people about before we go.
Indeed, there are. First and foremost, for those of you who are watching, did you hit the like button yet? I just want to say, I didn't have to yell this time. I was impressed. I kept checking, and we always had about the same number of likes as viewers. But if you haven't hit the like button, please do hit the like button. It helps us in the algorithm. And also, we do have exclusive content here on Breakthrough News, including most of my show dispatches, as well as a monthly seminar Eugene does on Africa, where you can actually join and ask questions. So if you want to access that exclusive content, please do go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and become a patron. It'll basically make you a member of Breakthrough News so you can access our exclusive content. We have that and so much more other stuff coming up for those of you who do give to the show. You can also, of course, donate on YouTube, do a one-time donation at breakthroughnews.org, but definitely encourage you to become a patron of the show.
No, absolutely. And thanks to everyone who's already a patron, made any sort of donation. Of course, thanks to everyone who joined us in terms of our guests, all of our viewing audience here. And of course, big shout out to our whole Breakthrough News team behind the scenes for making this show possible. That will do it for us here today on the Freedom Side. For myself, for Rania Khalek and Breakthrough News, we will see you next time.